as I'm sure you're all aware of, the March SAT and May SAT was canceled because of COVID-19. June 6th is going to be the next SAT, and that may be canceled too. We're not sure yet. All the College Board has said so far is that they have not canceled it yet, which to me reads a little bit that they may be canceling it also. But let's say we do have the June SAT, you definitely want to be ready for it, especially if you're a junior currently going into your senior year, or you're a sophomore, you're going into your junior year, and you want to be ready for it. If they do hold the June SAT this summer and you are a senior, that will be the last time that you can take the SAT to qualify for Bright Futures. Even if you've already graduated, you can still take the SAT a final time. So I really want to encourage everyone to use this time that you have at home with a little bit of social distancing. So maybe you're not seeing friends as often or going out as often, to use that time to keep reviewing and brush up on some of your skills so that when the SAT does roll around, if they announce, hey, like let's have a second one in June, or let's add a July one, that you're ready to go and you're not cramming at that point. So today we're going to go over all of the SAT basics. It's just a general review of things you have to know going into the test. And then I'm also going to plan a couple more of these virtual workshops where we will go more in depth into actual practice tests. Today we will just be referencing practice test 10 as needed. So the first document I'm busy here with is the determining your SAT target score. Let's see here. We are using, let's see here. Is my volume still low to you guys? If you can just respond yes or no. Or can you still hear me okay in the chat? Okay, volume's good, great. So the PDFs that we're using are in your email accounts. I can send you a link here really quickly too, to that email, just in case you didn't get it. Let me log in here real quick. I'm just gonna pull this up quickly. Campaign. Does anyone not have the materials in their email account? Just say yes before I go through here. Here we go. Here is the link to the email in the chat in case you did not get this email or you weren't able to download the materials yet. That contains all the materials we'll be using today. Okay. So before we ever take the SAT or start prepping for it, it's really important to have your goal in mind, because the way you're going to prep and the questions you're going to tackle will be vastly different if you're aiming for a 500 in math versus an 800 in math. Same for verbal. So before we get started today, I want to see here, let's ask you guys what your goal SAT math score is. So I'm launching a poll that you should see on your screen so that I can get an idea of where you guys are aiming to be. And this is completely anonymous. I can't see what you put or who put what. And that will help me guide where we're going to focus today and what we may skim over a little bit. See, half of you have voted already. I'm going to launch. This one's in progress. So once this one's done, I'll launch another one for the verbal one. Let's see here. So far we have 7 people have voted for the 700. Still 6 people that need a vote. Let's see here. Okay, so some of you have not voted. I'm going to end this poll, and then I'm going to do another one and I will share the results for this one. Everyone can see that. And I'm going to do another poll to just see what your goal verbal score is. If you guys can just quickly vote on that one too, so I can get an idea where you want to be. Do you guys see the new poll for the SAT verbal score? You can't see it. Let's see here. Let me end it and I'll relaunch it. Do you see the verbal poll now? Oh, there we go. Let's see here. So I feel like most of you want to score around a 1,300, 1,400 total. Let's see here. So I'm going to end this poll and I'll share the results so you guys can see what we have here. So when we're setting our target score, I like for students to have the score that they have in mind to get into the school of their dreams, but to also shoot a little bit above that, just so that they have a safeguard. Each SAT is curved a little bit, so there are going to be harder SATs and not so hard SATs. It's really difficult to predict which kind of SAT you're going to get. If you go online on Reddit or Google, you'll see all kinds of theories of take the August SAT or don't take the December SAT. But I don't really think that's reliable information, and I've seen it go both ways over the last 10 years of doing this. So if we look here at the determining your target score for UF right now, you want to score in the 1400s preferably. This past admission cycle for UF, I had a student that scored in the high 1400s get into the honors college, which is very competitive at UF. And then I also know of students that scored in the 1500s and were rejected by UF, by their regular admission cycle, so not even the honors college. So as important as the SAT is to put yourself in a good position for college admissions, it's not a guarantee. So just because you may not reach your target doesn't mean some of these schools are out of your league. And just because you do reach your target doesn't mean it's a guaranteed admission. You really want to make sure that you are looking at your application holistically, also looking at your extracurriculars, taking challenging classes. Community service is extremely important. So this is not your ticket in to these schools, but you do want to position yourself as best as possible so that you can be competitive when you do apply to any of these. So for Bright Futures, are most of you in Florida? You can just respond yes. I think I mainly have Tampa Bay students in this meeting today. So for Florida Bright Futures, it is changing next year, or for people graduating next year. The full Bright Futures, your score needs to be 40 points higher in total than it is currently. And for partial Bright Futures, that also increases by 40 points. We are not covering the ACT today, but just so you know, for the ACT, the partial Bright Futures ACT score has stayed the same, and the full one went up by a little bit. So that's interesting that they decided to keep that the same. The ACT starting this fall will also let you retake one section at a time. And with the current situation across the world, I think that the SAT may follow suit and do the same thing. So let's go on your, so figuring out the details. This is a form that you can fill out on your own to kind of get an idea of where you should aim. And once you have an idea of which score you want to get, so let's say you decide that your target score is a 1400 and you want a 700 in math and a 700 verbal. You know over here, so this is from practice test 1, that you need to answer approximately 50 out of the 58 math questions correctly. So you can skip or get wrong approximately 8 math questions. For verbal, it's a little trickier because you have to combine both your writing score and your reading score to get your actual verbal score. So we're gonna take a 35 for reading and a 35 for writing. And that would put you at about 5 skips for writing, and let's see here, about 9 skips for the reading section. So that's almost a whole passage. I always encourage students to not answer the reading passages in order, because you may run out of time and not have enough time to answer the last passage if you're doing those questions in order. And for a lot of students, the first passage is the hardest passage. So they're giving up points on a passage that may have been easier for them by just doing the passages in order. So what you'll find today is, for a lot of the tips we're gonna go over, it's not even knowing how to problem solve necessarily, it's just taking the test smartly. I didn't even know smartly is a word, but it's a word today. So for 2020, the SAT dates, obviously we're not gonna have March or May. June 6th is the next one. There will also be one in August, October, November. If you are not already registered for the June one and you think you may wanna take it, I would register for it really soon, as in this week, because it will fill up. There will be way more students taking the SAT this summer than I think ever in the past, because just think all those students that would have taken it in March and May are now getting pushed to June. And for a lot of students, especially seniors, where they received conditional acceptances to colleges based on boosting their SAT score, that is their last chance to get into school. So there's gonna be probably a lot of students signing up for that. And test centers do fill up, and you don't really want to be in the position where you have to travel an hour or 2 hours or further just to take the SAT. They are also not offering international SAT testing until August, which means that if international travel becomes available again and safe, that we'll see students coming from abroad to the US over the summer to take the SAT. They already do that at other times of the year, and I expect that would become more common this year. So someone asked if the extra math section at the end counts towards the math score, and it does not count towards your math score. The test section or experimental section, that is used to determine if questions are good questions to ask students for future SAT dates. So I do ask students to try their best on those questions, because you're doing future students a favor, just as I've done you a favor. So let's see here, we're gonna go into the core concepts handout that you guys should all have. So whenever I start with SAT prep, I always start with general test taking strategies, because they are so valuable, and I've seen students' scores go up by 50 points, 100 points, even 200 points, just by changing the way that they approach the test without even learning new concepts necessarily. So the most common errors that you're going to see on the SAT and even on tests in school will be misreading the question. So that's going to be if you thought the question asked for the circumference, but it really asked for the area of a circle, and you did all your work correctly, and you would know how to find the circumference instead of the area or vice versa, but you just misread it because you were going too fast. So going too fast would be a reason why you misread a question. So pacing yourself and really giving each question the attention it deserves is a good way to avoid a lot of these common errors. Another one is using the wrong information, and anyone is vulnerable to this. A lot of us will feel as if, well, not me, I would never do that. But when you're in a testing room and your stress levels are high and you think my future depends on how I do on this test, it is really easy to slip up and accidentally use the wrong information. So let's say you're using a geometry formula or just an equation. You accidentally put the slope where you should have put the y-intercept. You're just mixing things up, using the wrong information and getting the question wrong, even though you understand the concept. And that is the most tragic part about all of these common errors, is the student understands the concept. It's just in the test taking environment, they're slipping up and not demonstrating to the College Board that they do understand that concept. Next, we have lacking knowledge. So lacking knowledge gets kind of complicated on the SAT because it's not necessarily that you don't know the formula or equation or grammatical rule, you just don't know how to apply it. So in this case, today, we're gonna look at a lot of the foundational knowledge you need to go into the SAT, but it doesn't end there. You really have to take practice tests and put it into action to see if you can apply this foundational knowledge to the questions. I often have students come to me and they'll say, oh my gosh, Carla, you tell me that all I need to know to do really well on the SAT is the core concepts and critical thinking skills handout. But I just took a whole math section and none of those concepts were tested. And we will look at those questions one by one, and the student will see that actually they are all tested in there. They just didn't recognize it and they didn't understand how they could apply those concepts to the questions. So it's really a two-part game. You can't just know that y equals mx plus b is super important for the SAT if you don't also know how to identify and recognize those questions. Lastly is my personal favorite, bubbling in the wrong answer. I've read a lot of studies on this where students will bubble in the wrong answer for maybe 1 or 2 questions on a test, but that can be a 10 or 20 point score difference. And that can be the difference between a Fulbright Future Scholarship or not. So it's really important to develop a system, whether you answer all the questions on a page and then bubble them in one by one, or you answer all the questions in the whole section and give yourself 5 minutes at the end to bubble in all your answers. You really have to have a method for bubbling and stick to it so that you don't make silly mistakes. I've even seen students for the free response questions in the math section write down the correct answer. They do all the math correctly, and then they get the correct answer at the very end, and they go and write in the wrong answer. So this is something that happens all the time, and you need to be aware of it so that you can avoid doing that on test day. So when to skip. So a big thing that surprises a lot of students is you don't have to answer all of the questions unless you want an 800 in a section. To get a 700 or 1400 combined. So knowing when to skip, you need to know yourself, because the types of questions I'm going to skip and come back to at the end of the section will not be the same types of questions that you may need to skip. For me personally, I tend to skip some of the easier questions when I get to those grid-in questions for math, because my brain is overcomplicating things and I know that about myself. So I leave them to the very end so that I'm not stressed when I'm looking at them. And I take a deep breath and think to myself, I am not going to overcomplicate this. If you haven't taken pre-calc yet, or you are only in Algebra 1 and you haven't had Algebra 2 yet, you may want to skip questions that have trigonometry concepts in them, because I just have not learned this concept yet. So that's not going to be a good question to spend my time on. So you really need to know yourself to know when to skip. And by skipping, I do not mean leave it blank and don't answer it. You always want to bubble in something and have it there, even if it's a blank guess. Even for grid-in questions, you want to put a number there. Good guesses for grid-ins will be the question number. So let's say you are on question number 20 in the no calculator section and you have no idea what to put. It's a complete blank for you. Just put in 20 or put in 0 or put in the same number that they gave you in the question. So let's say they said that sine theta equals 4/5. What is cosine of 90 minus x, or 90 minus theta? And you have no idea how to do that problem, I would just take the 4/5 and bubble that in. Does this make sense to everyone so far? Any questions? Nope. Okay. So avoiding fatigue. So you're going to get the same point for an easy question as a hard question, and the College Board and the colleges that you will be applying to one day will never know what types of questions you actually attempted to answer. They will not know, hey, did John get a 700 math score because he answered all of the easy questions and skipped the hard ones? Or did John get a 550 on math and he got all of the hardest SAT math questions ever correct, but he just got all of the easier ones wrong because he hadn't seen those in years? So that's something that you really have to keep in mind. You're getting the same point for 1 + 1 = 2 type question as a question that requires you to do a whole page of algebra. I always encourage students to not burn out on questions. So if you know that this is going to take you a lot of time and energy to solve, it will be to your detriment in other sections if you burn out on that question. Same for the reading section. If you're not taking that in the smartest way possible, by the time you get to the math section, you're just not going to have the same energy and stamina to really answer those questions correctly. So guessing, I kind of already touched on. You need to answer every question. It's always wise to see if you can eliminate something that's obviously wrong. If you are dealing with a question that asks, what did the author of passage 1 say? And you can eliminate 2 questions that apply, 2 answer choices, sorry, that apply to passage 2. You can eliminate those and up your chances to answer the question correctly, even if you had no idea what the answer is. So tracking your progress, one of the biggest things I see with students is underestimating the time spent in preparing for the SAT. So the College Board recently took off practice tests 2 and 4. They removed that from their website. You can still find them online. But all of these other ones are still on their website. They're linked to Khan Academy. I recommend that students take all of the practice tests available, even twice, especially for math. Taking a practice test the first time just shows you what you know and what you don't know. It doesn't actually help you improve your score. What helps you improve your score is looking at which questions did you miss and which questions did you get right, so that you can brush up on those concepts for the questions that you missed and not make the same mistakes again. I know from experience in working with thousands of students that just looking at what you missed is not sufficient. So let's say I miss a question that deals with the quadratic formula. I can't just say next time, oh, I'll remember to do that. I will not, unless I reinforce that concept and I test myself before I take the SAT. The SAT day is not the day where you want to test to see if you retained a concept that you were kind of rusty on before. You really want to drill that in beforehand so that when you're taking the SAT, you are already confident in that concept and you're not thinking back, oh my gosh, this looks just like that other question I missed. I know there was an easy way to solve it. I could have just gone on my calculator, but I don't remember what app or what feature in the calculator to use to solve it. So let's go on. I'm gonna go to math first today, and then we're gonna come back and finish with reading. So for math, there's a couple things that we need to be aware of as we go in. The first thing is that we're going to approach the math section completely differently than we would the reading section or the writing and language section. And the biggest way that our difference will be is zooming in. So for the math section, you don't really want to get distracted by extra information that you don't need to solve the question. And you're not focused as in the reading section where you're zooming out to find the main idea. In math, you just want to identify what are the little pieces of information, what are the clues so that you can actually answer a question correctly. You also want to be wary of two-part questions. So there are a lot of math questions that require multiple steps. So if you only do the first step, even if you do it beautifully and you did the first part right, you're going to get 0 points because there's no partial credit. So you want to make sure after you've done your work to just go look at the question again to make sure that you're actually answering what they're asking. So let's say they asked you to solve for X, but instead you solved for Y. That's an easy catch if you go and check, did I solve for the right variable before you circle an answer? Because they know students will mix those two things up and they will give you the X coordinate as an option when they ask you to solve for Y or vice versa. You also want to think before you jump in and you do the problem. So the biggest thing that I see students doing is overcomplicating because they are solving SAT questions as if they're in the classroom and they're not. If you had to solve SAT math questions the same way you solve math questions in an algebra class or pre-cal class or any kind of high school math class, I would not be doing the job that I do. It would be insanely boring and tedious and would just take so much time. What makes the SAT fun for me and makes me keep on coming back and not giving up on it and makes me able to spend a Friday night with a new SAT practice test, just taking it by myself, seeing what's up, is that I get to think through them, and the SAT rewards critical thinking. And this is where the SAT kind of is a better test to prep for than the ACT in some parts, because the ACT rewards what you know. It does not really reward how you think. And the SAT really rewards how you think. So let's look at practice test 10. Let me pull that up here. I'm going to go to the math section. The no calculator math section, number 19. Let me just see here. And this question asks, based on the system of equations above, what is the value of 5x plus 5y? So if you were in a traditional math classroom, you would solve this either by substitution or elimination. And a lot of students actually jumped in and answered this question in that way. The way I know this is this was a real SAT math question 2 years ago, where a lot of my students actually took this test, and some of them actually used substitution elimination, and some of them got this question wrong, because the more work you do for a question, the more opportunity you introduce for errors. In this case, if I just zoom in into what the question is asking, and I think about what section I'm in and if there are any clues, I'm going to see a couple of clues. My first clue, so clue number 1, is this is a no calculator section. Clue number 2 is this is a system of equations. Clue 3, and this clue really seals the deal for me for this question, is that they want a combo of variables. They are not just asking for x or y by themselves. They are asking for 5x plus 5y. So whenever I have these 3 clues together, the first thing I'm going to do is spend time looking at this with my hands behind my back, not putting my pencil on the paper, and just thinking about what happens when I add these 2 equations or I subtract them. Can just doing the simplest amount of work, the easiest thing possible, get me the answer? So if I look at 2x minus this equation, 2x plus 3y equals 1200 minus 3x plus 2y equals 1300, that's not going to get me 5x plus 5y. But if I just simply add these 2 equations, I'm going to get 2x plus 3x equals 5x, and 3y plus 2y equals 5y, and 1200 plus 1300 equals 2500, and that is the answer to this question. So by zooming in on what the question is asking for and looking for clues, you can avoid a lot of the math that could introduce more opportunities for errors and increase the probability that you could get a question wrong. Next, I want to just talk a little bit about memorizing. So this core concepts and critical thinking skills handout, for the math portion, it's only 1 page front and back, and it's basically all of the core things that you need to know when you're taking an SAT. If I took the time to put it onto this piece of paper, then you should know that it's very, very likely for you to be tested on that concept on test day. My worst nightmare would be if someone erased the information that's on this page, front and back for math, and then told me to go take an SAT, if they erased that information from my brain. I find that horrifying because I know how frequently these concepts are tested. The biggest gift you can give yourself is to start memorizing this information now and practicing applying this information to SATs before test day. I have had students that procrastinate memorizing this information until the day before they take the test or the week before, and they're just not going to see the same results as a student that memorizes this information early on and really gets that practice in for applying it. Even if they come to me and they're like, yeah, I procrastinated, I waited until the week before to memorize this stuff, or the day before, and I increased my score by 200 points. I am not impressed, because I know that if they took the time to memorize this information earlier and do more practice, maybe they would have increased their score by 300 points or 400 points. So you may still get a big score increase procrastinating, but you're not going to be reaching your full potential, and that's really what I want for all of my students. So as we go through math questions, we're always going to look at reasonable answer choices. So the easiest way that you could accidentally pick a wrong answer choice is picking something that's not even possible. So if they're asking you about growth and you know the number is going to be increasing, you can immediately eliminate all the answer choices with numbers that are getting smaller because you know, oh, it's increasing. Even if you don't understand anything else about the problem, you can eliminate things that are just not possible. Same thing for if they're asking you to take the absolute value of a number. You know absolute value makes something positive, so you can eliminate any negative answer choice. You also want to pick which questions to answer first, and that kind of circles back to my earlier point that you do not necessarily want to answer the questions in order, and it's really to your benefit to get comfortable skipping over questions that the answer doesn't immediately jump out at you or the method that you should use to solve it. Because if you're burning time answering a question that's maybe out of your league or skill set, or maybe it's super obvious, but it's just not jumping out at you, you are giving up points later on because you could run out of time or mental energy for something that you're actually really good at. Any questions so far? Remember, there's the chat here, so you can chat with me if you think of anything that you want to ask or you want me to circle back to something that I went over really quickly. So a lot of test prep books will talk about picking numbers or back solving, and I'm not completely opposed to it, but I also use it as a last resort because if you pick the wrong numbers, it could not go your way. So don't pick one or numbers that are multiples of each other if you're picking numbers. And you also could be wasting a lot of time by picking numbers and needing to plug those into each answer choice instead of just answering the question in a more traditional method. How do you know you can pick numbers? So you can pick numbers if the answer choices all have variables. So if they give you information and all of the answer choices contain variables, that's a sign that you can pick your own numbers and then back solve. Showing your work. So we all have what's called working memory, which is the amount of information you can store in your brain at any given time. Really good test takers have amazing working memories. So they store a lot of information in there. So after they've read a passage and they get to the questions, they remember everything that was in the passage. After they read a math problem, they don't have to reference back to see what was the question actually asking and what was the given information because they're storing that all in their heads. If you do not have a great working memory, you can fake it by showing your work, which means that if I'm reading a question and it says, here's the y-intercept, I'm not just reading over that and not underlining anything and not writing anything down. I'm immediately going to write down, oh, this is y equals mx plus b because they just said there's a straight line, or this is the y-intercept, or constant slope. I'm thinking y equals mx plus b, and I'm writing it down so that I can reference that information later on. So a couple things. First thing, for this whole form that I'm going to be going over today, I'm going to be emailing you a copy of my key that I'm going through today so that you don't need to worry if you can't keep up and there's something to write down or you don't have access to a printer or pencils today. I'm going to send you this key. So for graphs, you always want to identify the slope, the x-intercept, and the y-intercept, which means that if they give me a graph, before I even read the question and see what are they asking for, I'm looking for my slope and my y-intercept. I'm always reading the labels too and paying attention to the scale. If you forget to pay attention to the scale and you're solving for the slope graphically by just looking at the graph, you could get the wrong slope. And they love giving you graphs with different scales. So in general, for the slope, I solve for it. I do not just look at a graph. Unless I'm running out of time and that's my only option, then I will revert to that. And when I see the phrase in the XY plane, I'm usually going to graph, because graphing those questions are in general way easier than when you solve those questions algebraically. Let's look here at an SAT math question. So here's an example of a question from an SAT math section where they give you this complicated figure and they ask you which of the following is an equation of the line that passes through points B and D. So for a lot of students, they will take this information, points C and E, those coordinates, and they will label those and find the equation of the line for C and E, then find the perpendicular slope, and then find the equation of the line that goes through B and D. You could, as an alternative, just draw the line that connects points B and D and see, oh, that is going to be a negative slope. So you can look at your answer choices and see, oh, they all have negative slopes. So that's not super helpful. And then you can see that the y-intercept is going to be here, somewhere between 2 and 4. And when we look at our answer choices, we can see that answer choice A has a negative y-intercept, so that's not possible. Answer choice B has a positive y-intercept because it's going to be -3 times -1. And answer choice C, the y-intercept is too big. And answer choice D, the y-intercept is too small, it's negative. So it has to be B, and we didn't have to do any algebra. All we had to do was draw a line. If you know that you draw really wobbly lines, I would recommend using your Scantron or bending your SAT test as a ruler to draw that line really straight, because it can save you a lot of time. Let's look at one more graphing type of question. So in this case, they gave a graph and they ask, notice here that the question is at the very end. And that happens really often with math questions that are super long. What they actually want you to find is at the very end. So you can just zoom in on that piece of information and then use the graph to answer the question. So they want to know which of the following could be an equation of the line of best fit. First thing I would look at is see, oh, I need a positive slope. But when I look at my answer choices, they all have positive slopes. Then when I look at my graph and I look for my y-intercept, I can see right here, this is not my y-intercept because x is not 0 there, x is 10. So I can extend my x-axis and extend this line right here and see that my y-intercept is going to be somewhere below 300. It doesn't have to be exact, but I can see it's maybe somewhere below 300, maybe around 100. And if I just zoom in on the y-intercepts for all of these questions, I know it has to be D. You could also solve this algebraically, but that would take a lot more time, which you don't really have the luxury of during a standardized test. You want to answer the questions as efficiently as possible. So there are two concepts that make up probably about 50% of SAT math. The first one is going to be parabolas, and the second one is going to be equations for a line. So these two, are going to be most important to you during SAT prep, and you should know them as well as you know your birthday or your name. You should know them frontwards and backwards and sideways in any way, shape, or form, because if you don't know these concepts super well, it will cost you massive points on test day. If you don't understand equations for a line extremely well, that could be 100, 150, 200 point difference in your SAT math score, which is huge. So for parabolas, there are 3 different forms that you have to be familiar with. So this is not an optional thing. I do not give busy work to students. So if I say, you should really know this, you really should. So the first form is your vertex form, where you have f of x equals some constant multiplied by x minus h squared plus k, and h and k is going to be your vertex there. The y-intercept form we're probably the most familiar with. So y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where c is your y-intercept. And then your x-intercept form is just your y-intercept form, except it is factored. So why are these important? If I see an equation in one of these forms, I'm immediately going to think, oh, I have a parabola. And if they give me the equation in the vertex form, I'm going to note the vertex. If they give it to me in the y-intercept form, I'm going to circle that y-intercept, and I'm going to think, you know what, that's probably going to be important. Let's go in our practice test here. And we're just going to look in section 3. Oops. Number 10. So they give us a graph here, and they say the graph is shown if the graph, oh, I'm not even reading further. I'm immediately noting they just gave me my y-intercept and marking that. If the graph crosses the y-axis at the point 0k, well, when x equals 0, y equals k, and that is your y-intercept. What is the value of k? It's just going to be 12. So this becomes a super easy question just by knowing that is the y-intercept form of a parabola. Because the SAT also has a no calculator math section, you need to know how to find the vertex of a parabola without using a calculator, which is going to be x equals negative b over 2a for the x coordinate of the vertex. You should also know that if there's a positive leading coefficient, that means when the a, that's going to be your leading coefficient. If that's positive, the parabola opens up. And I think of that as a happy parabola that's positive, so it's opening up. And if there's a negative leading coefficient, it's going to open down because it's a sad parabola. It's going to open down. It's pretty negative. You also want to know the equation of a circle. So for a circle, we're going to have x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared, where hk is the center and r is the radius. Your calculator also has the equation of a circle already stored in it, which we will look at in a little bit. But you should be familiar with this equation because if it appears on the SAT, you're not going to get those kinds of questions right unless you know this equation. So if we go to the very next question in practice test 10, so number 11 in the no calculator section, it says a circle in the XY plane has center 5, 7 and radius 2. Which of the following is an equation of the circle? And I would first write my equation of a circle. And then I would note this as HK, R equals 2. So I know R squared is going to be 2 squared or is going to be 4. So it can't be C or D. I'm always actively eliminating answer choices that could be wrong and solving questions in bits and pieces. So that improves accuracy. And then I know it's x minus h. So it's going to be x minus 5 and y minus 7. So it has to be a. And that's a question, that's a freebie question if you know this rule. PEMDAS becomes more important actually on the SAT for calculator sections. So there's a lot of awesome things that you can do on a graphing calculator, but they're all pretty useless to you unless you put in parentheses. It's going to be the most important feature that you're going to use on your calculator. So whenever you're putting things into your calculator, make sure you use parentheses. So let's say I want to find what is 5 divided by 3 pi. I would not just put it in the calculator like that. I would put in 5 divided by, open parentheses, 3 pi. And if you want to try that out, you'll see that you only get the right answer for the second method. Your calculator does not know what to do unless you tell it what to do. And one of the ways you tell it, hey, use PEMDAS, is by using those parentheses. So for percentage problems, whenever they don't give you the original amount, you're going to pick 100. It doesn't matter if it's reasonable or not. So let's say they say that I started by drinking X cups of coffee a day before I started practicing social distancing, and that amount has now gone up by 60%. I'm going to assume that I started by drinking 100 cups of coffee a day, and then because I said it went up by 60%, I'm going to use this one. It increased by X percent, so it's going to be 1 plus 0.6, which is equal to 1.6. So I'm going to take 100 times 1.6 and say that my new amount is 160. And that's how I would solve a question when they don't give the original amount. If they do give you the original amount, you don't have to use this, and you would get the question wrong if you did use this. For percentage problems, percent is just the part over the whole or the difference over the original. If they say that it increased by X percent, as I just did here, we're going to add that percent as a decimal to the number 1. And if they say decreased by X percent, we're going to subtract that percent expressed as a decimal from 1. Note that increased can also be growth or sales tax, and decreased can be decay. Let's see here. So for factoring, you should know these 3 factoring rules super well, meaning that if you see something that's factorable, you probably want to factor it, because they will never tell you, hey, factor this, but they will give you something that you could factor, and if you recognize it as factorable, the question will become a lot easier if you factor it first. So there are 3 ways here that you should know how to factor. We'll also go over how to factor in your calculator and use that in a little bit. Mean, median, and mode. So mean is going to be the average. So you add up all the numbers, you divide by how many there are. The median is going to be the middle number if you arrange the numbers from smallest to biggest. The mode is going to be the number that appears the most. And the range is going to be the difference between the smallest number and the biggest number. For the conjugate, if you see an I or imaginary number in the denominator of a fraction, or you see a radical in the denominator, you will have to use the conjugate, which means that you're going to take that same expression that's in the denominator, and if there's a minus, you're going to change that to a plus, or if there's a plus, you're going to change that to a minus. And you're going to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by that expression. If you get this kind of question in the calculator section, for imaginary numbers, your calculator will do the conjugate for you. So if we take, let's say, we're going to take, where's this? Let's say we have a question like this in a calculator section. So which of the following complex numbers is equivalent to that expression? So if you could not use a calculator, you would have to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the conjugate. But if this was in the calculator section, I could open up parentheses in my calculator and put 3 minus 5, and then your I is down here next to the period. So you would do second I, and then divide that by 8 plus 2i, like so. And then when you press enter, it's going to give you a kind of icky decimal, and you can press math frac and change that to a really nice expression in the a plus bi form. Do you guys have any questions about that so far? Nope. Okay, so we're going to go back here. Domain and range. For domain, you're going to look at the x-axis. For range, you're going to look at the y-axis. And for triangles, you're always going to draw them, especially right triangles. If they say in a right triangle, there's this side and that side, you're going to be way better off by drawing that triangle than just trying to solve it algebraically and thinking about the triangle in your head. This all comes back to working memory. For similar triangles, they're really special because they have the same trigonometric proportions. That means that if they tell you that one triangle is similar to another one, you can just deal with the original triangle instead of trying to find sides of the new triangle. If we look in test 10, on that same page at number 12, if they say in the figure above, triangle ABC is similar to triangle DEF, what is the value of cosine E? All we need to know is that cosine of E is going to be the same as cosine of B, because DEF is similar to ABC, and you can see that B and E are both in the middle there. So I can, at this point, completely ignore that triangle and just think of cosine B is going to be equal to cosine E, and cosine B is just adjacent over hypotenuse. So that's just going to be 12 over 13 as the answer. The radii of circle also form isosceles triangles. I will be honest with you, this does not appear on every single SAT. It's every couple of SATs this will come up. And when it does, it makes the question way easier, just knowing that if you have a circle and you have a radius, and let's say they want to find that angle, and you're like, whoa, how can I find that angle? But you also have this side over here, and they give you this angle as x. Let's say they gave you it's 20 degrees. You can connect this here and then find those two angles because it's an isosceles triangle. So it's just something that's good to have in your back pocket, remembering that the radii of circles form isosceles triangles. Equations for a line. So like I said before, the bulk of your questions will deal with this concept. So there have been SATs where they will have y equals mx plus b questions. Like every third question deals with this concept, which is really tragic for students that don't fully understand it. So slope-intercept form, that's going to be y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. Standard form, ax plus by equals c. So this is something down here that's not really taught that much in schools, as far as I know, where the slope equals negative a over b, or negative a to b when you have it in standard form, which you can use to find the perpendicular slope really quickly without converting the standard form back to the slope-intercept form. So if I was given a line that, let's say, is 5x plus 2y equals 3, and I want the equation of a line that's perpendicular to that line, I would flip my 2 and 5, and I would make one of them negative. Doesn't really matter which one. and that line is going to be perpendicular to my original line. And then point slope form, y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1 is going to be useful if you need to find the equation of a line and you're given 2 coordinates. Or 1 coordinate and the slope. Let's go back up here. We're going to come back to calculators in a minute. So prime numbers are only divisible by 1 in themselves. 1 is not prime, and negative numbers are not prime. Integers are going to be whole numbers, including negative numbers and including 0. It's important to know what integers are, not because they'll ask you which one of these answer choices is an integer. They will ask you a completely unrelated question and then ask you to express your final answer as an integer. So even if you did the whole complicated math problem, if at the very end you don't know what an integer is, you're going to get the question wrong because you wouldn't know I need to round this to a whole number. So probability. So on the SAT, probability is a lot simpler than you're going to find on the ACT if you're taking both tests. On the ACT, they get a little bit more complicated with stats, and we'll have you look at sample space and independent and dependent and those kinds of things. But on the SAT, they keep it pretty simple, and you just need to know that probability is the total outcomes in the denominator and the desired outcomes or possibilities in the numerator. And if you see the word and or both, you're going to want to multiply those probabilities. If you see the word or, you're going to want to add the one probability to the other probability. So if I ask a question that says, what is the probability of having ice cream and cookies tonight? That's an and question. So if the individual probability of each one is 50% or 1/2, I would take 1/2 times 1/2, which gives me 1/4, which gives me 25% probability of having both tonight, or cookies and ice cream. If I ask a probability question that's an or question, I add the individual probabilities. So I'm going to get a bigger combined probability than if I had an and question. So if I say, what is the probability of having ice cream or cookies tonight? I would take the probability of having cookies, which is 1/2, and add it to the probability of having ice cream, which is another 1/2, and I would get a whole or 100%. So it's a much bigger. So the or questions, you're going to get a bigger answer or a bigger percent probability than for an and question. So if you are dealing with an and you get a number or a percent that's bigger than what you started with, that's a cause for alarm that you probably did something wrong as you went along with the question. So for word problems, which is basically the bulk of SAT math, is going to be word problems because they want you to interpret the questions to then do the math. They're not going to simply tell you, hey, use y equals mx plus b, or this is a good time to use the slope, or this is a trick question. They don't tell you that. They just give you clues. So it's really important to be able to interpret the problems so that you can apply the concepts that you already know to the question and get those questions right. So if you see the words what number, that's going to be plug in a variable. It's something that's not given. So I just put x here, but you could put any variable. If you see the word of, that means multiply. Sum, you're going to add. Difference, subtract. Product, again, you're going to multiply. And the quotient's going to be division. And you are pretty much guaranteed to see all of these questions. Questions containing this kind of language on the SAT. This is one of those things that's just a guarantee. You're going to see it on there. One of the big ones that they love testing students on is that f of x equals y. For some reason, that can get confusing, especially up here where I have this example of f of 5 equals what. You want to be able to read that as they're really asking what is y when x equals 5, since f of 5 is just a different way of saying f of x. So what is y, which is f of x, when x equals 5? Your y-intercept, x-intercept, and slope. So for the x-intercept, you're going to take the number or variable, comma, 0. So this is going to be a clue that you want to find the x-intercept if they gave you something like b, comma, 0. You should immediately think, oh my gosh, they just gave me my x-intercept. I'm probably going to need that. Same thing for if you see a 0 in a table. If they have the 0 for the y, you're going to think, oh, that's the x-intercept. I'm probably going to need that. They particularly love y-intercepts, which is going to be 0 and then the number or the variable, or 0 for x in a table and then the number or variable for y. They also really enjoy asking for the y-intercept as what is f of 0, and having students recognize that f of 0 is just your y-intercept. For slope, the triangle means change. So we have change in y over change in x, or you can think of this as rise over run, or y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. It's a good idea when you're given coordinates to label which one's going to be your y2 and y1 and x2 and x1. Area of a sector and arc length. So your sector is just going to be a piece of the pie, and your arc length is going to be a piece of the circumference. So for sector, we're going to use the area of the whole circle, and for arc length, we're going to use a piece of the circumference. When you're using these equations, also remember, instead of putting area of a sector over the area of a circle, you could put sector A over sector B, or arc A over arc B. So there have been a lot of SAT questions in recent times where they require students to take these equations a step further and recognize that it's not just a proportion of the one part of the circle to the whole circle. You can set up a proportion of one piece of the circle to another piece of the circle. If you are given radians, you can also use this equation with radians for the central angle, but then you need to use 2 pi in the denominator instead of 360 degrees. SOHCAHTOA, you will need to know just the very basics of trig. So trigonometry, pre-calculus does not get that complicated on the SAT. So we have our old favorites. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, tan is opposite over adjacent. Tan theta is going to be sine theta over cosine theta. And it's really important here to know, and this is not going to be on every single SAT, but if it's on the one that you're going to be taking later this year or next year, you will get this question right just by knowing this fact. And those are my favorite kinds of questions. If I just need to know one thing and I don't have to do any work, I'm just recognizing that's what they're asking. So if I see 90 minus x, I'm immediately thinking, ooh, that is a complementary angle. And then I'm remembering that sine and cosine of complementary angles are going to be equal. That means that sine of 10 degrees is going to equal cosine of 80 degrees. And you can try that out in your calculator and you'll see you'll get the exact same numbers. Or sine of 50 degrees is going to equal cosine of 40 degrees. Then for a trig table, so this is for more complicated questions. So if you've already had pre-calc or you're currently taking pre-calc, I would know how to set up the trig table. If you're going to be taking the SAT and you want above it a 700, I would know how to do this. So we're always going to start, I'm going to just erase this. by going 0, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60, 90. And then sine goes first, because I think of sine as selfish. Or you can think of, in SOHCAHTOA, sine goes first. So either way works. And then we're going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So all we're doing here is we're counting up to 4, starting with 0. And then for cosine, we're going to count down from 4. So 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Then we're going to square root everything. So everything gets a square root. And then we're going to divide everything by 2. So if a question asks me, hey, what is sine of 60 degrees? And I don't have my calculator, I know sine of 60 is going to be the square root of 3 over 2. Or what is cosine of 90 degrees? Well, that's a square root of 0 over 2, which would just be equal to 0. So that's a really handy trick to find this information without a calculator. The quadratic formula, you should also know. If you don't feel that comfortable with the quadratic formula, you could complete the square instead, or you could use your calculator. The discriminant, I find, is the most important part of using the quadratic formula. That's the one part that your calculator or completing the square cannot really take the place of. And the SAT won't ask you, hey, what is the discriminant? They will ask you how many solutions. Or you'll see in the question 2 solutions, or no real solutions, or 1 real solution. So these are all clues for you need to use your discriminant. Parallel lines. So the only geometry on the SAT is generally very simple. They don't get super complicated with it. So parallel lines, you should know that alternate interior angles, corresponding angles, vertical angles, and alternate exterior angles are all equal. And that straight angles, so that's what I have over here, this is going to be a straight angle, is going to be equal to 180 degrees. Imaginary numbers are going to be the square root of -1, and I squared equals -1. Again, you can use your calculator for imaginary numbers, and for a lot of SAT questions, you can treat I as a variable. So just because you see I in a question doesn't mean that you necessarily have to know that it's equal to the square root of -1 or use the conjugate or do any of that stuff, especially if it appears in the first couple of questions in a math section. Then we also have for variable exponents. So whenever you see variable exponents in a question, you're going to start by setting the bases equal to each other. And in order to do that, you need to have the same base. So my starting point, if I saw a question like this where I have 8 to the a power equals 4, I'm going to start by making the 8 and 4 the same base. So I'm going to make them both a 2. So that's going to be 2 to the 3a equals 2 squared. And then I can eliminate my bases because it's the same base and have 3a equals 2 or a equals 2/3. For the distance questions, you need to know 2 ways to find distance. The first is just distance equals rate times time, or distance equals velocity times time. And the second distance formula is for if they give you 2 coordinates and you need to find the distance between those coordinates. A classic case of this would be if they give you the coordinate of the center of a circle and the coordinate of an endpoint on the circle, then you can find the radius by finding the distance connecting those 2 points. Midpoint formula, you should also know. So you're going to add up the x coordinates, divide by 2, and then add up the y coordinates and divide by 2. For absolute value, so you want to remember that absolute value questions, they expect you to know that what's inside the absolute value bars would be made positive by the absolute value bars. And then to solve an equation with absolute value, you're going to start by isolating the absolute value expression. And then when you remove the absolute value bars, you have to set it equal to a positive and negative of whatever was on the other side of the equal sign. No solution versus infinite solutions. So this is an SAT favorite. I would give this 10 more stars. So super important, and you're pretty much guaranteed to see this on your SAT in one way or another. There have been recent SATs where they test students on this concept more than once in the same section, or they test a student twice in no calculator and twice in calculator on this one concept. So when you see the words no solution in a question, you want to remember that that just means that the lines are parallel, so they're going to have the same slope. And if they have infinite solutions, it's the same line. So it's going to have the same y-intercept and the same slope. So if we go in practice test 10, section 3, and we go to question number 15 here. So practice test 10, section 3. I see I have a system of equations. A is a constant. Which of the following of A does a system have no solution? So no solution is my most important part of this question. And I'm going to know that no solution means parallel lines. So same slope. And remember when we went over equations for a line where it's ax plus by equals c? It's only a and b that give you the slope. C becomes the y-intercept. So we don't care about the y-intercept for the given information. And because they say they're wanting you to solve for A, and parallel lines have the same slope, when I zoom in here, I can see here, there's a 2 coefficient for y. So up here, I need to multiply this by 2 so that this becomes -6, and this becomes 2y. And at that point, I can see that A is just going to be -6. Let's go back here. So exponent rules, I'm not going to go over these in detail today because there's just not time, but it will be in the email that I'm going to blast out that has all of this information in it. And then I just want to touch on the reference information that's at the beginning of every single math section, because a lot of students forget that it's there, or they don't know when to use it or how to use it. So it's important to recognize these shapes at the bottom and know what they're called, because they won't tell you which formula to use, but they will ask you, hey, find the volume of a rectangular pyramid. And then you should know, oh, this last shape down here is the rectangular pyramid, and that's the volume equation for it, and that it's given. So I expect students to, at the very least, be super familiar with this information, if not memorize it. When I personally took the SAT quite a while ago, I memorized all of this information so that I had it handy in my brain, and I did not have to spend time looking back for it unless I blanked out and I needed to. They also give you that 360 degrees equals 2 pi down here when they tell you that there's 2 pi radians in a circle, or 360 degrees. And then they give you all the basics. So the area and circumference of a circle, area of a rectangle, triangle. They give you the Pythagorean theorem right here. And then you can use those special right triangles on no calculator questions instead of using the Pythagorean theorem. So that's also an option. So real quick, for calculators on the SAT, there's a couple of things that you can do. I'm going to switch my screen sharing here for a second. Boom, boom, boom. Can you share? I'm gonna stop the share and have a new share. Let me just see here. Okay. Okay. So on your calculator, if you turn it on, I do recommend using the TI-84 plus CE. There's a couple of things that you can do. So here you can see on my screen a little bit better when I put that imaginary equation in here earlier. So I put 3 minus 5i divided by a plus 2i. And once I put that in, when I pressed enter, it gave me this ugly expression, which I then converted to a fraction by going math frac. So let's go through these one by one. So the first thing on your calculator is math frac that I want you to know. You can go to math and frac to convert a decimal to a fraction, or you can convert a fraction to a decimal. You can also go down here to the fifth option, which allows you to take the nth root of any number. So I could take the sixth root of 6289 just in the calculator. You also can use math, go over to num. The first option there is apps, and that allows you to take the absolute value of any number. So you could put a whole expression in there. I could do 2 times this plus something else. I could also go to y equals and graph an absolute value to see what that looks like as a graph. Another thing that I like using the math feature for is if I go up 1 to numeric solver, I can use this to solve any equation. So let's see if there's a good one in our practice test. If you look at number 21 in section 4 of practice test 10, you're gonna see an equation there, which I could plug in directly here. I could go 0.1x plus 0.2 times 100 equals 0.18 times x plus 100. And then press graph again to solve it, and it gives me x equals 25. So it just solved that whole equation for me by just plugging it in. Let's do a quick poll here for if you guys know I've ever used some of this stuff. So I'm launching a poll about polysmelt right now, if you guys will vote. Or let me relaunch it, actually. I'm gonna relaunch it. There we go. You'll just quickly vote in here. Okay, so the majority of you have not, or about 50-50. So we are going to look at polysmelt here. So if I clear out of this, I can go to apps and then down to polysmelt. Press enter, and then I can go to polynomial root finder. So this is going to be like using the quadratic formula, except in your calculator. So the order is 2 for a regular quadratic. I want real solutions, auto, normal. I'm going to go next. And then I can put in any quadratic in here. Let's say 1x squared plus 6x plus 9. We'll just keep it simple. And then it's going to solve for x for me here. I can go second quit to go out of that. Have you guys use simultaneous equation solver? So that's a second polysmelt option. So I have 2 equations, 2 unknowns. And I can put in equations here. So I'm going to do one from, let's see, practice test 10. So this is going to be question number 25 in the calculator section of practice test 10. I'm just going to plug it in right here. So 2.4x minus 1.5 y equals 0.3, and then 1.6x plus 0.5y equals negative 1.3. So someone asked if other calculators also have this feature. So the TI-84 Plus can also do this. It just looks a little different. And there are other calculator models that can do similar things, but you would need to look in their user manuals to figure out how. I find that the TI-84 Plus CE is going to be the most user-friendly and the fastest way to get the correct answer, basically. So to solve this, I'm going to press graph, and it's going to give me x equals negative 1/2. I can convert that to a decimal by pressing the graph button again. I'm going to launch another quick poll just to see how many of you have used an equals on your graphing calculator, which we're going to look at next. You guys will vote. So an equals you can use to graph inequalities on your graphing calculator and solve for answers. So I'm going to go to apps and then go down to an equals. So that allowed me to just open up an equals. So now I'm going to go to the left, and a box is going to appear around it, and I'm going to press enter, and that's going to allow me to change my inequality symbol. So I'm just going to do that one to demonstrate, and then I can do x plus 2 just as a simple line, press graph, and it's going to draw the line, and it's going to shade it for me. So I could go back to y equals, I could do another line. Let's just make it that one and make that like negative x. And it can do 2 lines for me too. So I would see here that where it's shading for both of them, right over here, is where the solution is going to be for that inequality set. So let's see here. I'm going to do another quick little poll. If you guys have used the Connix app in your calculator before, you'll vote on that. So for the Connix app, you're going to go to apps and then go down to Connix. And the most useful one for the SAT is going to be the circle. So we're going to press enter for the circle. And this allows you to graph a circle that's given to you in either form. So let's just go for the second form here. And I would enter the coefficients in the equation given, press graph, and then I would press trace, and that would allow me to move around on my circle. So that's for graphing circles. I could go back here, and I could also graph a circle given in this form. So let's say that's my H, K, and R, and I could graph it. So either way. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm gonna go back on my iPad. I think those are the biggest ones that I wanted to go over for math there. And we are gonna share a different screen. There we go. There we go. Okay. So So we're gonna go over reading and writing and language here. I'm not gonna read through a whole passage today. Once I schedule another one of these, we'll go a little bit more in depth in how to apply the stuff that we're covering today. I just intend this to be a general review of things you should know going into the SAT. So whenever you approach a new reading section, you want to keep in mind that you're going to be zooming out. And this is going to be completely different than we're approaching the math section, right? Where we're zooming in. So for SAT reading, they are really testing to see how would you do as a freshman in college, where you're going to get a lot of reading material and you need to come to class prepared and you need to know what the main idea was for whatever your professor assigned for your readings. So as you read for SAT reading passages, you want to keep in mind, I'm zooming out. I'm not going to get bogged down by the details as I'm reading it initially. And I'm going to look for the main idea. And I'm also going to look for the tone. Just does the author feel positive, negative, or neutral about the subject matter? Because that enables me to eliminate incorrect answer choices. If you have a passage that is about eating tacos in Mexico and the author loves going on vacation in Mexico and eating tacos, if I have an answer choice that talks about burgers in California and the answer choice is super negative about tacos, I know it's the wrong answer choice because it's not dealing with tacos, it's talking about burgers, and the tone is negative, so it's out. So how do you find the main idea and the tone, right? So we're gonna look for words of contrast like but. It doesn't have to be the word but, it could be not. So this, not that, or although, however. And the key information for a passage in general comes right after those words of contrast. And if you really focus on circling those words of contrast as you're reading, you're gonna find that time and time again, when you get questions that direct you to a certain part of the passage, that's the part of the passage the question will direct you to. So I think of words of contrast like speed bumps. So when I'm reading a passage, I'm reading super fast. I'm talking about like under a minute for a whole passage that I'm reading in. And whenever I see a word of contrast, I'm slowing down a little bit and I'm thinking about, oh, like I need to pay attention here because it's probably going to give me a big clue about the main idea or the tone. Another big thing that can help you figure out the main idea and the tone is reading the introduction. So a lot of students don't really enjoy reading the introduction because no question will ever ask you about the introduction, so it seems kind of pointless. But the introduction often gives you the who, what, when, where, or why. So it will say this passage is set in the 1700s. It's so-and-so's response to this book that was published, and other information, maybe what country it was in. And reading that information and getting an idea of what you're actually going to be covering throughout the passage allows you to kind of make an assumption and set up an expectation for what you're about to read. And when you're making that assumption and you're setting up that expectation, you're either going to prove yourself right or you're going to prove yourself wrong as you continue reading. And whenever we're proven right or wrong, we tend to pay more attention. So if I think this passage is going to be about pizza and I start reading and I'm like, oh, it's totally about pizza, I'm going to give myself a pat on the shoulder and I'm going to pay more attention because I'm going to think I'm totally right. Or if I think that the passage is going to be about polar bears and I start reading and it's actually not about polar bears, it's about some kind of ice cream called polar something, I'm going to chuckle to myself and think, whoa, I was totally wrong. This is not about polar bears. This is about some kind of polar treat. That helps you engage with really boring material, which sometimes the reading passages can be a little bit like put you to sleep almost, or they can be hard to focus on. So it's really useful to have these clues to know when do you need to pay attention and what do you need to look for. So when you're approaching these reading sections, you also want to avoid primary definitions. What that means is you want to avoid the first thing that pops in your head when it asks you, what does this word mean? And you instead want to look at the context. That means that you want to look before and after. So if they ask you, what does this word mean in sentence 10? You want to go look at sentences 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 and 12 and think about the context that that word was used in instead of only looking within that one sentence. A good idea for those kinds of questions is also to replace the word with a word that you would pick before you look at the answer choices. Once you've looked at the answer choices, you're kind of already tainted and you can no longer use this strategy. But if you're physically covering up those answer choices and thinking about what you could put there instead, what you would pick, and that goes to using your own words basically, and then you match what you would have picked to the options, you are gonna have way better luck getting the questions correct. For dual passages, I recommend that students read one passage at a time. So that means you're only going to read the first passage and then answer all the questions on the first passage. And then you're going to read the second passage and answer only the questions on the second passage. So this helps prevent you getting confused between the two passages, so that if the question, let's say both questions are about farming, and the first question is about farming produce, like vegetables, and the second passage is about farming animals. If you're answering questions only on the first passage and it starts talking about cows or pigs, you're gonna be like, there weren't any cows or pigs in that passage. It was only about vegetables. Those answer choices have to be wrong. They have nothing to do with the main idea. If you've already read both passages, when you get to that question, you're gonna have to go and look back and think, wait, in which passage did they talk about the animals again? And since this is a timed test, you really wanna make sure that you're being efficient and you're kind of building in safeguards to prevent yourself from getting confused or wasting time double checking things when you could just be right from the get-go. Then for line reference questions, so that's going to be the same as for questions that ask you how is this word used or what's another word we could use instead. We want to read before and after the line reference, not just where they tell you to read, because then you can get the context of that line reference. If you have a question that asks you, how is this used? And then the next question says, what is the evidence for the previous question? It can be helpful to first do the evidence question and see which one of those line references would actually answer the question, the previous one, and then come back to it. So we can look here in practice test 10 for an example of that kind of question, where it says which choice provides the best evidence for the previous question. So you can plug in all these line references into this question. It can be reasonably inferred, and then match up those answer choices to the line reference that you picked. But I will go into more detail with that during a different session when we go through each question in detail. So that's for line references. So right now, everyone really has the gift of time. If you're not a reader, it's a good idea to start becoming a reader. Usually when students come to me, they have 6 to 8 weeks to prep for the SAT. And that's not a lot of time to really up your reading speed or improve your reading comprehension. It can be really difficult to do that. But right now, you guys have months where you can start reading literature, read good news sources like science and technology, and become faster readers by the time you take the SAT. Reading quickly will help you not just in the reading section, it will help you in math when you're reading those questions. It's really the best thing that you could do with your time over the next few weeks is kind of get off social media and get a book from the bookshelf or go to the library online. So if you have a library card, you can get books online and send them to your phone or your iPad or your computer without going to the library. Your password to set that up is usually the last 4 digits of your phone number. So if you already have a library card and you've never used that feature, at least for Pinellas and Hillsborough County, they tend to just use the last 4 digits of your phone number as your passcode. So then for writing in language. So there's a couple things that I have narrowed down that you really need to know. You all should also have this grammar handout in your emails. And this grammar handout is a very in-depth version of what is in the core concepts and critical thinking skills handout. So the core concepts handout is basically just an outline to trigger your memory as you're reviewing daily or the day of the SAT if you just want a quick review, whereas the larger grammar handout is really meant for you to study so that you can understand these concepts. So the grammar handout that I shared with you guys has helped so many students that I've known get perfect scores on the grammar section. If it's not in this handout, it's pretty much not going to be on the grammar section. Now that you have this, there is pretty much no excuse to not score in the 99th percentile for the writing and language section of the SAT. You should only be missing like 3 or 4 questions maximum in that section if you're really studying this information and taking practice tests. This is going to be the easiest section on the whole SAT to improve your score on. So if you are just looking for a small increment score gain to get to the next tier of a scholarship, or I would say if you don't have a lot of time to study, but you guys all do have plenty of time to study, this is going to be the biggest payoff for the smallest time investment. So when we look over here at our key, so there are certain things that I just watch out for in the grammar section. That doesn't mean I'm never going to pick an answer choice that has one of these problems. It just means that I need to have a justification for picking an answer choice that contains an it, or the word being, or an ing ending, or the answer choice is super long, or it has the word was. It doesn't mean these answer choices will never be right. Sometimes they will be right, but I'm going to be extra careful with picking an answer choice that has one of those problems. So when I see a writing and language question, if I see the word being, I'm immediately going to cross out the word being to just kind of note, ooh, that answer choice has a problem. I'm going to see if I can pick another answer choice that doesn't have any problems or that doesn't have being that's grammatically correct. Throughout the whole writing and language section, you're basically editing a paper as if you're peer editing or you're the teacher. So the SAT wants you to write in a way that's really consistent and also concise. That's one of the reasons that shorter answer choices will be correct more often than not, because they want you to use fewer words to express what you're trying to say. So you have to, throughout the whole writing section, make what is underlined match what is not. Oops. Make what is underlined So this applies to consistency. It applies to parallelism. So if you have items in a series, I have to say I like to swim, to bike, to run. I can't alternate between those by saying I like to swim, running, biking. I can't do that. For verbs, so when we're looking at a tense, we're also going to make what is underlined match what is not underlined. So if the whole paragraph is in past tense, I can't just randomly switch to future tense without some kind of justification. For pronouns, when I see any pronoun down here, I'm going to be circling them and I'm going to be looking at what noun are they referring to because I have to make what is underlined, right, match what is not underlined. So this is kind of like playing Where's Waldo? You need to go find the information and make sure that it matches up. So if I see the word it, I'm going to circle it, and I'm going to make sure that it's actually referring to a singular noun, right? Not a woman or a man or a group of things. Modifiers. So there's certain like clues within the writing section, and you'll get better at identifying them the more questions you answer. So if I see a phrase and then a comma and then something underlined right after it, I'm immediately going to think this is a misplaced modifier question, that they may put here the house or car. And then you need to make sure that what came before that comma modifies what comes after it. So I can't say born in Mexico, the house, right? It's a person or something that's usually born, not an inanimate object. So when I'm looking at those answer choices, I can save time because I know I just care about that first thing that comes after the comma, that it's what's being modified by before, what came before. So semicolons. So semicolons are basically equal to periods and equal to a comma and. I recently had a student ask me, so semicolons are equal to periods, are you sure they're equal? And I was like, yeah, they're equal, they're the same thing. And then the student said that in their next essay, they're not going to use any periods after sentences and only semicolons. And that's not what I mean here. I just mean within the same sentence, you can use a semicolon instead of a period to join two sentences that are related. So every now and then, the SAT really ups the difficulty with these kinds of questions, and it will make you pick between a colon, a semicolon, and a comma and, which seems super cruel, and you would think, no way are you going to use a colon instead of a semicolon to join two related sentences. But you can if the second sentence explains the first sentence. Then you need to use a colon instead of using the comma and or the semicolon. So, and that grammar handout goes into detail with that rule. So redundancy, remember how I said that SAT writing, they want you to be concise, which means they want you to not be repetitive. So if the information's already stated, you don't want to say it again. On the ACT, redundancy questions are super obvious most of the time. For the SAT, I always check for redundancy before no change. So before I say there's no change, I'm going to check to see, was there a redundancy problem? Because the redundancy problem can occur earlier in the paragraph or in another sentence. If I say that I was in Africa on a safari and I saw a bunch of lions at the very beginning of the paragraph, I don't have to later on in that paragraph say in Africa having lunch, because I've already told the reader, hey, I'm in Africa right now having this whole experience. So, but when you're just reading that sentence by itself, it doesn't sound grammatically wrong to say in Africa when I was having lunch. But when you look at the context, when you look at the whole paragraph, you'll see, oh, the reader already knows you're in Africa. You don't have to say it again. So commas can get very tricky. There's a lot of comma rules to know. I will say for any punctuation questions, so a way you can identify that a question is just testing you on straight punctuation is all the answer choices contain the same words, but they differ in punctuation. So let's see this question. Do you see everything is the same, except I need to decide between a period, a colon, nothing, or a semicolon. So in that case, I would circle all the punctuation in the original sentence so that I'm not missing punctuation and I can clearly see everything that's going on in there. So we're going to need commas to separate two complete sentences. So if I have a subject and a verb on both sides, I need a comma and. I'm also going to need a comma between a dependent clause and an independent clause. So if I have something introducing the next part, the first part cannot stand on its own. So I need a comma. You also need commas around non-essential words or phrases. You could use a dash on either side instead of a comma, but you cannot do a dash comma or a comma dash, which is why it's important to circle all the punctuation so that you can keep track of all of it. You're also going to use commas to separate items in a list after introductory words or phrases. So that would be if I have like consequently, then I need a comma after it. And then to separate adjectives whose order can be reversed. Let's see here. So verbs, subject-verb agreement is a huge part of SAT writing and language. They love testing you on subject-verb agreement. And in order to make the subject-verb agreement questions exponentially easier, you need to learn what are prepositions so that you can eliminate those prepositional phrases. So if we look in the grammar handout, and I look at the sentence, illegal logging right here. In Mexican forests have resulted in the destruction of the monarch butterfly's habitat. So in Mexican forests is going to be a prepositional phrase because of in right there. So I can eliminate it when I'm picking my verb for my subject and just read this sentence as illegal logging have resulted. And then it becomes really clear that I have the wrong verb. But if I read illegal logging in Mexican forests have resulted, that doesn't sound bad. And that's one of the things about the writing and language section. Most of the questions, even when the answer choices are wrong, they're designed to still sound good. So you need to know your grammar rules so that you have a grammatical basis for eliminating an answer choice. Just saying, oh, that sounds good or that sounds bad, that's not enough of a reason to keep something or eliminate it. So we're going to look in here. For verbs too, whenever I see any kind of time reference in a passage, so if it says in summer 2045 or in the year 1700 or in 5 years, I'm thinking, oh, that's a time reference. So I'm just going to be on high alert for changing verb tenses later on. And remember, for tense questions, we're going to make what is underlined match what is not. The meaning questions I find are the hardest for students. So when you're dealing with, should you use consequently, however, although, furthermore, which sentence transition do you need to pick, adding or deleting sentences, moving sentences around, all of those deal with meaning. So what actually is the author trying to say? So what I do is I have to find evidence for whatever I'm going to do. So if I want to move a sentence, I need to make sure that there's evidence for moving it. So there's a piece of information in an earlier sentence that needs to be joined to that sentence. Or if I'm picking a different transition, I'm going to cross out whichever transition they gave me. So let's say, however, was written there. I would cross it out, and then I would think of, does the piece of information that came before conflict or contrast with information that comes next? I'm going to determine the relationship. And then I'm going to pick, where do I move sentences? So even though meaning questions can kind of seem like a shot in the dark sometimes, oh, like, how do I know this is the right answer? It's important to know there will be contextual clues in the passage that 100% tells you what to do. If they didn't have those clues, it couldn't be standardized, and it's a standardized test. So think about if it's not there, then a parent could just go knock on the College Board's door and say, hey, give my student this point. There's no evidence to say that it should be C instead of B. And then someone from the College Board would point them to the part of the passage and say, look, it's clearly right there. That's the only answer choice that would work because of this. So you're trying to find the reason of why does it need to be there? What is the piece of information that I need to find? Word pairs, these ones always go together. So neither nor, either or, not only but also, as. So you can't use not only without using but also on the SAT. You can't say neither or, you have to say neither nor. For the next couple here, who versus whom. So who always does something, so it's going to be plus a verb. Whom is kind of lazy. It doesn't do anything, and it's going to be plus a preposition, which is why it's really important to know your prepositions. You can look them up online to get long lists. The most common ones are going to be like of, in, to. Those are going to be super common prepositions, but it's really good to be familiar with all of them. Whose versus whose, they sound the same. The first one here is who is, where this whose is possessive. Then versus then. So then you're comparing things, and then it's a sequence. This happened, then something else happened. For then questions, you want to be super careful because it's indicating a comparison is taking place. And on the SAT, you want to compare like things. So you have to compare people to people, things to things. You also want to make sure that you're keeping the same format for how you're comparing both things. There, and there. So the first one is going to be they are, then there as in possessive, and over there as a place. And like versus as. So never pick like if you have the option to pick as. That's going to be the easiest one. So I'm going to open this up to any questions. If you guys have any questions, now's your time. And I'm also, once I can figure out how, going to share a link with you that will give you the opportunity to share any feedback about what we did today, and also give me input for future programs you would like or how you would like this changed, since I'm gonna have quite a few weeks where I'm probably gonna do more of these until we get back into the regular swing of things. So this right here is the link for the workshop evaluation on my website. Do you guys have any questions before I sign off today? If you can just say no in the chat, then I know you can hear me and that you have no questions. Nope. Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna sign off for today. Hope this was helpful and that you guys either learned something new or had a good review for prepping for the SAT. Okay, bye-bye.